Welcome to the next episode on catalyzing radical systemic change. The title of today's episode is Investigating Building Blocks Towards a Planetary Civilization. Preparing for that, I asked myself, isn't it a bit of a hybrid? Like Alistair and Julian Guderley, diving into the weeds of the building blocks? And I actually thought no. And I want to start this episode very personal. I think one of the first things that I saw as a child was an organism in a bottle as a picture. And my father explained to me that this organism in a bottle is a little bit like the miniature size of the whole planet. So this bottle exists, I think it's bottled for 40, 50, 60 years. And it's like a closed system. And my father explained me like Gaia, like our mother organism, this planet we're living on, is actually not really much the same. So like any trash you put out there, like stays there if it is produced not in a way that is like sustainable to be like a nutrient and like to be like recycled or upcycled like Mother Nature does. And I still remember pretty late in my adulthood reading a book that's been published in 1968, this very famous book from Buckminster Fuller, where he describes also the fact, it's called like Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, that actually none of us, right? Or the other way put, like we are all like crew. None of us is just passengers on this spaceship called Earth. And I'm feeling very grateful today to be able to dive into like a deep conversation with Julian Guderley. What I find specifically interesting about our encounter is that you, Julian, you've done 300 podcast episodes. And before we dive deeper into like why you're doing that and stuff like that, maybe you give our audience just a snapshot of who is that human being on the other side of the planet? Because I'm still here in Guatemala, flying to Mexico. You're in Brazil. So I'm really curious what brought you to where you are today. Happy to hand over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Alistair. It's a pleasure to be here with you and, find our way into this conversation and answer all of the questions and more. I'm in Brazil, as you said, for this recording. I spend what the Northern Hemisphere calls winter in Brazil. My partner is Brazilian, and we are just getting ready this week for a 12-day immersion with a group of internationals, Brazilians, people from South America, people from North America, to dive deeper into, this kind of emerging topic of communities and what that means for us as a planetary species or planetary society. So it's a really good bridge. This is my here and now where I'm sitting. I also did grow up in Germany, just like you, with two German boys, in Central and South America, having this conversation on the internet, which if we just zoom out a little bit, it just boggles my mind because 30 years ago, none of this was imaginable, So let's always remember, especially as we're going into these conversations, that everything is really possible and none of us know definitely, and we're all finding our way into what is our authentic role to play. And in that authentic and unique contribution that each of us have to give, that's when we start to play. That's when it starts to get exciting. And, you mentioned it, I just got to this magic number 300 on my podcast, Green Planet, Blue Planet. I just started recording a few years ago. I realized I want to have more conversations with people that do amazing things in the world and weave connection among them, invite them to retreats, invite them into different programs, see them both as my teachers as well as my peers, breaking a little bit the lines of hierarchy, and also just following my quest of my own quest, which is a desire to be a lifelong learner, a desire to continue to be curious, a desire to, lead with curiosity, and also understand that there is a very interesting movement of humans coming together, and that is tons of people that are trying in different bioregions on the planet to see how can we live a true life in freedom and purpose. And so that's what I'm dedicated to. That's what I'm in service of, is that journey in myself, in my own life, in my own relationships, with what I do digitally, with what I do as my work. And so that's why we're here in this conversation.
Let's take my first question. I know we prepared this a little bit before, a couple of days ago, but when I look at a couple of assumptions that I certainly have, I always coin myself like an integral heretic, and I just want to briefly sketch that for the audience so that we can riff off that and take it like just kind of like a background matrix almost to make sense of what we're talking about here. So the integral model from Ken Wilber and others that I stumbled upon when I was 24 is like an integral meta theory that basically makes the assumption that we can cluster or create buckets knowingly that they don't represent reality. These are literally just sketchboards for our mind to grasp the incomprehensible mystery that life is, which basically states that in order for the grand transition that we all encounter as a species and try to make sense of and position ourselves into, we need like systemic change, the systems piece, which is the governance piece, the United Nations, the way monetary systems work, and the more. There's a cultural piece that we all carry. Certainly, I can't 100% abstract from me being brought up in Germany in a pretty much left-wing household. And I also can't 100% abstract from me being a physically male human being doing meditation and plant medicine since many years. So just very briefly sketching, I think it's important that we try time and again in our conversation to come back with these like frames of reference that we're using as to enable our audience to make sense of what we're actually talking about. So when I look at your podcast, I know you started rather intuitively, but I sense that you also had like some assumptions, some guiding questions, like almost like a theory of change behind you doing the podcast. And I'm really curious to like dive into what was emerging, out of everything that you have been recording so far. I mean, it's a lot of things you have been done.
Yeah, thanks for that setup, Alistair. And I do appreciate you, giving your best a sketch into framework, just the different perspectives that we're here sharing and our backdrops to it. I think what's been emerging throughout the podcast, and part of it was an intuitive feeling, which is why I started it, but I really saw it emerge throughout the podcast, is number one, and I'm not saying this as a cliche, I truly mean it, there are so many amazing human beings on the planet. You listening right now, you're probably one of them, like so many amazing people on the planet trying and wanting to find a way to purposefully express who they are and finding a way to have that contribute to a greater good. So the second thing that emerged is that if we try to create global governance or a global government, we will fail. That is what is already in place, are these, circles of corruption, these circles of governmental control that they are currently imploding. The United Nations is maybe a good attempt towards being more humanitarian, but also ultimately is wrapped into this form of corruption. And at this point, it would not be authentic for me not to say that at the beginning, right? So I'm in no means of a favor for a globalized way of government for this planet. However, since we're all connected, we all get to exchange our experiences and our ideas through what we currently call the internet. Maybe that will move in the future a little bit, but through these forms of dialogue and resource sharing. The solutions will all be bioregional or local, as people like to say, because every bioregion of life on the planet has a different intelligence that wants to be tapped into, right? Just like if you were to live in a climate where there's 4 seasons, different things are needed than if you live in a climate where, you're in the mountains and there is only rainy season and hot season. So bioregional, local is where change happens. And then our global kind of mind game, I think for one, we got to allow it to implode and only take forward the the purified, innocent, and dedicated concepts that are really serving people all over the world. So what I'm trying to say is there's lots and lots of conversation out there, and you're one of those people, Alistair, that is having these kind of dialogues. And I think it's very important that they're being had. And that's why I started podcasting as well. But my journey actually brought me multiple times to some of the bigger corporate conglomerates, and my faith in them has pretty much died because of the level of corruption and the level of just control that goes hand in hand with it. And so just wanted to context that at the very beginning, right? Change is bio-regional, and that means there's a lot possible. And that's one of the emerging themes throughout Green Planet, Blue Planet's interviews, that the possibilities are basically endless as long as we collaborate with the intelligence of life. And we as humans understand our role of birthing life, like in syntropic farming or in agroforestry. We're here to connect with life, to birth more life, rather than trying to control life and try to put life into boxes that we can then, pay taxes on.
Would like to riff off that. So although almost everything that fell out of your mouth, I could just underline and repeat. I personally don't think that, or it's not my gut feeling that all of global governance can be done only on a bioregional level. I would say what we need, what's a very clever thing, at least in the way like Germany is governed, is like subsidiarity, which basically means the higher level of governance is not allowed to take from the lower, smaller, more local level of governance what the more local governance can meaningfully orchestrate like itself. I though think that the way governance needs to be structured is to give a lot more emphasis on the bioregions. Definitely, I think we don't have to talk so much about that, but I think we have like quite a lot of phenomena on the planet, one of which being like now with the Ukraine crisis, obviously again this like, we have nuclear weapons, right? So I'm not too sure how we can solve the proliferation of like nuclear weapons like on a bioregional level, or the massive amounts of plastic. To my humble knowledge, I'm bad with numbers, but we will produce just in the next 10 to 20 years more plastic than has ever been produced. And when we just look at the scale of the problems we already have, I think also there we need like a clever mix of bioregional solutions, but also a truly transnational new way to organize, which I think we both agree can't be the way the United Nations are working now, like the United Nations that we built like in 1948, right? I mean, it's outdated, it's corrupt, it has multiple gridlock effects, the Security Council doesn't work the way like could or should work. So yeah, just curious on your personal opinion on how to layer these various levels of governance.
Well, this is such an interesting conversation already, because again, I want to just say I don't know, right? Like that's the real truth. But what's emerging for me in the context, and from having listened to 300 people that I've interviewed in different contexts and different topics, but it leans into the form of governance and also like the future of finance. I believe that cultural change is only going to happen in what we call local or bioregions, meaning the cultures are going to come from what's actually on the ground, our actual interaction with planet Earth. Because the last 20, 30 years, our culture came entirely from a globalist, capitalist kind of messenger, right? Like our cell phones, our computers that used to be, one in a house. Remember those days when a computer was like 10 megabyte or 100 megabyte big, and now you have that on your cell phone, right? In 1,000-fold. So that movement of the last 30 years, I think, got us here, but I don't think it's necessarily how we're going to go forward. And so the cultural piece, I do believe, comes from the local and bioregional part. Now, what you say about governance, I do agree that we will continue to exchange knowledge across the entire planet. And so that kind of knowledge, you know, it for me, it is very simple. It simply has to be able to supersede the control, hierarchy, and corruption function of the current global governance system. Because what we have right now is a certain kind of world order, through media, it's held in place, because whatever the media tells people is what many people believe. If it's true or not is another question. And so this global kind of thinking, again, there's a certain part of danger in it. And I think we will have to really see what is the future of a decentralized culture on this planet. And that's the quest that I'm curious about, because we see it even with Bitcoin. The moment a government can control a cryptocurrency, or the moment a government or corporations have heavy influence on blockchain or a specific cryptocurrency, we're basically just replicating what's already here in with fiat or current governance circles. And so don't know if that's a super clear answer on your question, but it's definitely an approach to understand that we're now able to identify what we can't continue to produce. Otherwise, we will just have more social inequality, we'll have more poverty, we'll have more pollution, right? And maybe to add that on your idea around plastic, like, yes, as a global culture, we will have to say no to many things. No to the theater of televised supervision. No to, in my own words, the parts of the COVID theater. No to certain elements of corruption, and so that no needs to materialize in our actions. No to plastic. People want it, but then we kind of feel powerless against the forces at play, right? And so that's the real, quotation marks here, the real battle in our lifetime, is to stand in our no in a way that future generations can look back at us and say, oh, so you did more than, scroll on Instagram and like beautiful pictures. You actually stood against this impeding order of tyranny.
What I'm moving to the second question, if you were to cherry pick empowering, visionary, hands-on examples that really make a difference, what would be those encounters with people, organizations, and projects? And again, in the systems piece, what are organizations, projects where you would say they really, at least on a prototypical level, have new, better, healthier ways to change, for example, the monetary piece, or the way we distribute technology, or the power piece. And again, you can translate that then again into let's say, quote unquote, other buckets like culture or personal transformation. Because I think what I would like to get out of that podcast is almost, what would be your cherry picks? What are your learnings, after so many encounters? What would be, the nuggets of gold, of wisdom, of encouragement? Because we live in such crucial times. People are really desperately in search for this inspiration.
Yeah, I love how your mind works, Alistair. I'm grateful for your prompts and your questions here. So, my cherry pick golden nugget wisdom. Here we go. So, step one, stay inspired. So, physically, literally, find a way to do breath work, to do meditation, whatever practice works for you. So you arrive in your body in the present moment, right? Stay inspired. Step two is find your tribe, connect with the people that you have more connection with than just an ideological or a conceptual agreement on what your minds think is fancy or makes sense. But find your tribe with whom you can celebrate and grieve, and with whom you could grow food with, right? It's very important in this time, I believe, to be surrounded, quite the opposite of separation and sit at home in your little, cabin or office. It's find the people that you love spending time with, because for our mental health, for our well-being, also for our gut health, we need to share space with other people. There's so much science on this. And then when it comes to the cherry-picked, projects that I've interviewed, I'm going to share that. I want to say one more thing. So I said, stay inspired and find your tribe. The third kind of leg for that is, if it was a tripod, is make it your life's mission to embody your most authentic purpose. Serve your own becoming in that sense, because you, as a powerful human in her or his own integrity, saying no to the things you don't like and saying yes to what your heart and your being calls for. That's really what the world needs, right? So our mission with these podcasts, Alistair, I believe, is to empower and encourage all individuals to tap into their unique gifts and to express them into the world. And, the way I understood and interpret my own podcasting, coaching, event creation, etc., is to do that exactly. It's a version of my gift of just expressing who I am to my best ability, and connecting this to projects that I can learn from, inviting people that can maybe learn from me. So there's like a give and a take, an exchange, and kind of always moving forward. So some of these cherry-picked projects, I think the first person coming to mind is John Dennis Liu, who created, he's one of the co-producers of Kiss the Ground, a Netflix movie. And he's also the creator of the, of regenerative camps. So basically, it's a structure that allows people in any local bioregion to come together around regenerative agriculture and regenerative reforesting, not just prompts, but instructions, basically, and form camps for people to literally create soil, create a regenerative impact in their own local world. And so this is one of the most powerful projects I've seen out there. I'm going to make sure to give you the link to it as well, because it's just, it really, really, really moves the needle to allow many, many people in different areas around the world to have this kind of an impact. They're called ecosystem restoration camps. That's the proper name of it. Ecosystem restoration camps. And, John Dennis Liu actually has the history in Kiss the Ground that comes up. They show this example of regenerating a whole plateau, I believe in China, in Asia, where they revitalized an entirely like barren, dry soil, no more water, part of land, and within 10, 15 years, all the way till the water flow came back, And so if you look at these examples where, we can literally see life seems to be void, like a death piece of land that turns around into a live piece of land based on how the humans interact with it. That's really the gist of, or the big takeaway from what I've been learning is, we as humans have to find our role, not just as these, void, lifeless technology gods, but as a biological marker within the ecosystem. And when we take our role as that, that's when thrival starts to show up. Another great insight for me was a conversation with Louis Schwartzberg. He is the filmmaker of Fantastic Fungi, another film that I believe in some countries might be on Netflix at this point. And, Fantastic Fungi goes into the beauty and the power of mushrooms, fungi, and the mycelium, and the interconnection of the ecological world and the biological world. And Louis actually, he shares with a passion about his last decades, 30, 40 years that he's been filming slow motion and time-lapse growth of flowers, of mushrooms, of different organisms that we as humans would usually not perceive in the same way, because a mushroom grows overnight. But if you time-lapse film it, or slow motion film a flower opening, now we as humans can understand that nature is actually breathing. Nature is breathing with life force, right? The way water comes in and out of a place. Nature is breathing with life force, the way a mushroom opens and then helps compost a dead tree, for example. And so it's things like that, that when you apply them to the way we build culture, when you apply them to the way we build governance or even finance, right? It's things like that that allow us to learn from nature in a whole other way. Just to balance it out there with a few females, I'm gonna just bring up two more examples.
Okay.
One is Starhawk, who is really famous with her writing in the permaculture design world. That was a deeply moving conversation for me, simply based on the deep wisdom that she embodies and walks. And another conversation I really loved. And then, there's 300, so there's so many. But another awesome lady that I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing is Céline Cousteau, the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, who has created a film around the preservation of the Amazon rainforest here in Brazil. And so, that's maybe the last piece I want to share as a golden nugget here is us learning from the natural ways also includes us learning from the last living indigenous cultures, because those cultures, those hunter-gatherers, they have a very, very unique and different way to interpret life. And I believe in what's coming, the years ahead of us, we will require to integrate some of those wisdoms and some of those learnings from these cultures. And so Celine, with her movie, created a great legacy piece to build one of those bridges.
I would like to invite you to kind of, in Latin, you would say like la quinta essentia. Mm-hmm. Like when you look at the projects and the people you just mentioned, what is an underlying set of values? From which place do they live? How does it feel interacting with them? So I almost try to sense with you in between the lines of the filament of what unites these people, despite them having different projects, different perspectives. Curious on your words on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So that filament would be a reverence, a respect, and an understanding of life and the life force that connects all living creatures. So if we were to compare that, if you were to go, and I've been to these places, United Nations or other great world order government instruments, there the filament is money, hierarchy, and power. And if you have a position of hierarchy, power, or you earn the money that you require to execute that power, that's a very, very, very different filament. And there is a lineup of people that would like to be in those positions in the entire world. And many of them are actually innocent with powerful intention, but they just think those are the right clubs where to play, But the people I've interviewed, it's quite the opposite. Their reverence is firstly to life, and their role of being an alive human. What I mean with that is their purpose. And purpose isn't something that is easily defined, because in modern English, purpose is a word that's being thrown around a lot. But that purpose, again, is connected to life, service of life. And, a cynical mind could now say, well, how do those people know what is in service to life? But that's why the cynical mind will never create a peaceful culture. We have to do the yogic journey, the journey, the longest journey that's in front of us, from the mind into the heart, our individual heart. And when we start to feel and we connect, and many people, and I assume everybody who's listening knows that experience to some degree, when we make that journey into the heart, a lot of the world's chaos doesn't make any sense anymore, And so the filament of the people that I've been very curious about, and that I believe are here to start a new culture and to connect cultural streams from indigenous treasures, from some of our powerful intellectual brothers and sisters that have left some insights. But those people I've interviewed, they're all reverent to life itself first. And that's kind of the best I can say it without getting too spiritual in my answer.
When I look at the people interfacing with me personally, I'd usually perceive them from different perspective, but for the sake of being able to ask you a question, what would be your recommendations for someone kind of at the beginning or just having started on the inner journey? If there's any abstract recommendation you can give, because I have my answers, but then like, what's your recommendation for someone who is like already has an access, they already have an access to let's say their various body regions and what makes them having this human experience, they have a certain connection to their purpose. And then finally, how do you interact with those that like are aligned, that have found their purpose, that are powerful? Because I have the feeling almost everybody I encounter like falls into this like beginning of the journey, middle of the journey, kind of like, I would not say end of the journey, but kind of like stable plateau of contribution, right? Where basically me as the matchmaker and the weaver comes in, the people in the middle, right? Where I directly invite them to interact with me, also, you know, in my ways to coach. And the people at the very beginning, where I usually say, I might not be the right person, but I can recommend you a therapist, a shaman, an immersion, a program, a spiritual teacher, go to a Vipassana retreat. So yeah, I hope that was clear enough in form of a couple of questions into your direction of how how your very specific way of interacting with the many people that you interface with,
Yeah, I think I understand más o menos. Like I get what you're asking. It's curious, because the mind likes to label and differentiate things. And I agree, I concur. There are certain kind of stages that you can observe that most of us go through. But the first recommendation would always be commit to the journey, commit to your journey, commit to your own path, commit to that unfolding, that self-development, because that is true if it's the first time that you're ever thinking about this, or if you were born with a family that supported you in your spiritual unfolding, or if you're a devout yogi who is on the path of self-realization. It would always be true to simply commit to your journey. And if you're, as you said, like in the middle box, like you've already been on that journey for a while, and now you're like, what's the next step? Even more so, commit again to yourself. Because when you commit to that becoming of yourself, that development of who you are as a soul and as a heart on this planet, then you will be of service to the collective and the earth itself, right? It only actually goes this way. You can't try to intellectually understand it without supporting yourself first. So it's quite an interesting paradox. That's recommendation number one: continue to commit to your journey. And then, well, wherever someone is in their own journey, the question is, what are you creating from that place? Are you currently, if you're at the very beginning, are you maybe creating healing space for yourself so there you can heal from some trauma or some past occurrences to be able to be more present, right? Are you recovering from workaholicism or any form of addiction? There's different things that you would be creating in that stage of your life, right? Is usually the space to breathe, the space to reconnect, as you said, different tools like immersions, meditations, Vipassana retreats, different teachers, different coaches could help. And then if you are at a place where you feel like you're in the juice of your life and you're here to play, then simply start sharing and spreading that message, and your allies will start to show up and ask people for support, and not in a colonial like economic bill only, where it's like, I need this to get there, right? We live in relationship. The human intelligence only expresses and unfolds in relationship to self and the all, or source energy, or God, whatever we want to call it, and in relationship to other human beings, right? To other, and not other non-humans as well, like animals and plants. And so in those relationships, is where we can find a reflection of our purpose and a reflection of our whereabout. And so if someone is really far on their journey, my recommendation would still be the same: commit to that journey and provide for your dream, for your experience, right?
Yes, I think again I have the feeling I want to get like very personal here,
Please do,
because
yeah.
when people listen, I've not prepared this, but when I look in the stages of my life, maybe it's truly more like a spiral or an entangled piece of wool, because I certainly know that in my life, for whatever reason, I often had like this impulse of stepping up, but often I put like too much weight, so to say, on the bench press as a metaphor,
Hmm.
which was my personal journey. And secondly, I encountered time and again unhealthy patterns in my life, from addiction to, like you said, workaholism. So I would say that almost in the middle phase of these three sketched very broad buckets, I would say what saved me was my mentors and teachers, and being actually very humble, and to have the focus on the inner work, which is very interesting, because often people now, when they see me like seemingly successful, whatever that means, or like, but
Hmm.
like I have cool projects, amazing people, solid income, they asked me, how did you do that? And I said, well, this was a long journey and a lot of inner work. So for all those of you listening out there, I'm really just to take this with a twinkle in an eye, because there's not one recommendation that is like right or wrong per se, because it's so individual. But for all those of you who have done humongous amounts of inner work, and you're still afraid of showing up, I would definitely recommend like show up, because you have done so much inner work, right? And maybe it's just your own perfectionism hindering you from showing up and finding your tribe and finding the aligned business model and the right strategic partners. For all those who have been mainly on the outsides of what makes us human, right? So like career, family, a lot of money, fame, power, whatever, famous positions, then maybe truly it's like, if you're not happy with that, it's time to like stop, take a break, do a sabbatical, fly to Iquitos, do ayahuasca, whatever, So yeah, I just had this aha moment, because when you were sharing from your perspective, I really had the feeling, sometimes I have the feeling people are stepping up too early, right? They did like a tiny amount of inner work, but in a monastic setting, in a classical monastic setting, they're still in a stage of apprenticeship, so they're really still like learning a little bit about meditation or breath work or ayahuasca, because I see so many people, working as shamans these days, where me personally, coming from a monastic context and having had very senior, very old teachers with like decades of experience, right? I always told myself, I don't want to be looked upon to be in that category of like, I'm an ayahuasquero because, I did ayahuasca, whatever, 12
Last
times,
year,
15 times. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, or just 2 times.
Yeah, I
So,
hear you. I hear you on that. There's a few things you just said, if I may touch on them
yeah,
and kind of
please.
see if I can untie the knot. So personally, I made a similar experience in you. Breathwork, for example, has been in my life for way over a decade at this point. In the first like 5 years, I was absolutely pushing against teaching any form of breathwork or yoga or meditation in my life. At the time, I owned a studio space and I was able to bring teachers into my own space. One of those things on my purpose of expressing who I am was, at some point, that inner voice, the one that you listen to and realize it's in touch with life, said, open a space, create this practice space for your community, but really also for yourself. And so in that space, I was completely pushing against teaching myself. I wanted to just be a learner. And for 2 years, that was powerful. But then at some point, that point arrived where I saw tons of people, as you say I'm a shaman because I had 10 sessions and now I'm here to share all this. And I realized, oh, wow, if I don't stand up and offer what I have to offer at this point, after 10 plus years of being in this, exposed to this world of different teachers and different whatever, then I'm not standing in my integrity of sharing one of my gifts. Right? So there is a bit of a paradoxical play with the world around us. But then there's a few other layers of what you just said, you know? So big picture, we're not here to try to micromanage life. In the old paradigm, we were here to control life, to fight nature, to subdue any culture that isn't following the orders. That's just at this point, you know, the old world that we're hospicing to death. We're not here to micromanage life, or if you want to call it that, God. We're here to welcome and receive what life has to give us, and to come into syntonia or synchronicity or receptivity with that energy of life. Now, that's a very different approach. And in that approach, different things will show up for everyone. You know, I too, for a while, definitely was, you know, suffering with this idea of perfectionism. But perfectionism is like a strategy to be valued for how you do things, rather than to be valued simply for who you're being, you know? And so with perfectionism comes a certain form of performance. But real life is not about performance. Real life is about who you're being, how it feels to be around you. And how, when it feels good to be around you, then how we can do things together. Right? And so in my own journey there, you know, just to make it really personally, there were multiple layers of waking up. You know, the first one had to do with traveling abroad for the first time for an extended amount of time as a teenager, when I left Germany and went to Paraguay in South America. Tell that story often in other podcasts. I won't digress on it today, but that was such a level of awakening for me as a teenager, reconnecting with my soul's imprint or my essence, you know, in another culture, then coming back to Germany and being like, wow, this is, you know, this is a clusterfuck that people have created for themselves here. Everyone's always angry and depressed about things not working out and cynically controlling that everything should work. Now, that was the culture I came back to. I know Germany has many other sides to it that are beautiful. You know, and then on the journey, I tried to work in the corporate world for a little bit, because everyone told me it's such a great thing to do. And that's where to get your salary and your position and your purpose. And I realized that, for one, it wasn't for me, but two, it doesn't create a life that is life affirming. It doesn't create a society that is just. It doesn't create a world that is healthy. You know, a healthy planet doesn't need companies to dump plastic pollution or to dump pesticides onto food. It's just not the way it works. And if you disagree with that, I might not be the guy to listen to, you know. But if you already have an inkling of that, my message is, let that inkling grow bigger. Follow that deep knowing of, we could call it your soul, we could call it your heart, we could call it your inner presence. But that part of us knows, and that part of us wants to come out and play, but not on a stage like a performer who can hide behind perfectionism. I've definitely went through that loophole myself, as I already said. But it wants to play in a way that we're visible, that we're acknowledged for who we're being, that we are being seen, and when we do something wrong, and then we clean up, and we're being seen and cleaning up. Like, you know, when you make food, you have to clean the dishes after. There are these cycles in life, and we want to embrace them rather than try to control them. And I believe that's the cultural change that's happening on the entire planet, not from an external force onto the planet, but from an internal force through people as consciousness unfolding or as energy unfolding.
Before I move on to like a more, you know, structured, you know, let's see what the next bullet point was, you know, is the older I get and the more subjectively integrated, happy, healthy, powerful, playful, joyful my life is, the more I truly think that the big questions already children get. So when you were mentioning the story on pesticides, right? Okay, I'm hyper biased because I come from an organic farming family. But when you tell a child, that you dump toxic stuff on produce that you're eating, right? I mean, the child would look at you and say, what are you doing? The same, obviously, with nuclear weapons. So I totally agree with you that I believe we have an innate, intuitive understanding. The founder of Tamara calls it like a sacred matrix, right? We intuitively grasp when there's love in between our parents or our siblings and in our neighborhood, and when there's like a safe space where we can develop as children. And I'm not saying children know it all. That would be a classical pre-trans fallacy. I'm not going into the pre-trans fallacy. Who wants to know more about the pre-trans fallacy? Google it, or get on my website and look the video on the pre-trans fallacy, which basically means children and enlightened people are the same because they're both not rational, but pre-rational and trans-rational. So you need to be pre-rational, then rational and trans-rational. They appear to the mind the same, but they're not the same. So when Jesus said, become like children, he didn't say, throw a tantrum when your girlfriend tells you to buy veggies, right? But in the sense of become like children, to trust your heart that nuclear weapons are just an insanity, and hopefully at least in a couple of decades or in a couple of centuries in the future, right, they will be hopefully just be a footnote, right, in the history of us as a species. So that was literally not a question. It was more like riffing off your own understanding of,
it's your podcast, mate. I loved hearing you do that. That's awesome.
What I'm curious to listen in is we can't predict the future, but us sensing into the future, which I love since I'm a small child, and not from the head, literally more from the heart, or maybe including head and heart. And I don't mean this only on like plant medicine, psychedelic journeys, literally just as how I imagine us as a planetary species in peace, harmony, and abundance with our mother organism in the future. I have the feeling this can come a lot quicker than many of us think. Because in my understanding, the technological layer that we already have now, so not thinking about like more advanced technology and fancy AI, but just the technological layer that we have now with the internet we have, the photovoltaic we have, and all the knowledge and wisdom we have, can create, in my understanding, abundance for all earthlings, meaning descendants of the apes, humans, restore and heal the many wounds we inflicted on our mother organism. And in my heart, it took me a long while to discover that place. I truly feel, I know this is a contradiction now with Ukraine, but I don't mind. I truly feel eternal peace on a global level, on a planetary level, is the only way to move forward. So this might now get a little bit like overly esoteric for some of the listeners, but I'm really curious to sense into this like big dream, this big vision that I think most of us, if we're not deeply traumatized and we did not grow up in war, or we're so traumatized, right? I really think in our heart, we all share that same dream of peace, unity, abundance, health, joy, reciprocity, fun, celebration, right? That's the truth. The other thing is an agenda set from people that want to control us, right? At least how I see it or sense it.
Well, I'll sense into that myself over here a little bit, and and share some of my views on that. So first, I love this idea of sensing the future because we cannot predict it. However, we can create it based on what we're choosing. And when we choose to listen, follow, adhere, and obey the colonial powers of terrorism, then we will not create a peaceful future. What I mean with that is that this period, the 2020s, is extremely important because I don't know all the details, but the clubs that currently run governments and industries, and it's so simple, just follow the money. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist. You don't need to get lost in all kinds of rabbit holes, but just follow the money. The way our planet is run is very destructive and benefits a few. And Alistair and I already talked about that, right? So as long as we're choosing to obey or adhere or follow that club, what you're sensing into there in the more esoteric realms of peace and togetherness, it's going to become very, very difficult, right? So to a degree, we have to become able to stand in a sovereign no and a no thank you, to then pivot and create the future that we actually desire, that, as you say, I agree with you, Alistair, is in our hearts, is in our shared dream, is in the dream of all the indigenous people that have come before us. And the way there, we will have to reconcile a lot of our wrongdoing as cultures, as individuals, as countries, as humans towards the living organisms of the planet. What I'm sensing, and sensing all the way into the future of, generations past us, I'm sensing a switch into that sovereignty towards life again. Because what is running the planet and what is creating war, and there are wars, but they're businesses on this planet. That's what we can't overlook. These wars are businesses. And so these businesses, they are run on death as a driving force to make people afraid and to separate us, right? And so what I'm sensing as a united future can only be a future that's based on life. That's what brings me back to the beginning of this interview, right? And all of these people that I interviewed, that what connects them is a reverence for life, a reverence and a desire for life to prosper more. And not to get too esoteric, but to get a bit, like metaphorical here. When the sun rises every day, or the earth eclipses around the sun, and, we get the phenomena of the sunrise, no country, no president, no billionaire does anything for this. This is one of the forces of life. It's a cosmic phenomena. We're in spin and rotation. And so that's what I mean with in favor for life, in favor for, if you're a big science fan, you could even say following science, but then we have to, asterisk, non-biased, non-corporate science, because in this world right now, there's a lot of scientificism with purchased science and then broadcast around the media. So we have to leave this current paradigm by saying no to it. That's step one, to sense the future. And then from there, literally anything is possible. Everything is already here, as you said. So technologically, we've had literally electric cars 100 years ago, they did get suppressed. And this is also something that's not secret knowledge anymore. You can just dig a little bit, right? So the technology is here. It's a question of us deploying it and trusting ourselves to not need to be governed by someone else. And so once that begins, I believe, and I see it beginning actually at this time on the planet, now everything becomes possible, and the generations after us can hopefully be born into true freedom and true togetherness and true unity, rather than into the indoctrination of the programs of the past and the fears of death and the fears of those programs of the past. And so I'm sensing a world where, one of, I believe, our generations, I was born in 1987, our generation's biggest legacies will be how we bring new children, new earthlings into this world. Are we able to bring kids into this world without wearing masks, without watching CNN or BBC, without following the programs of industrial revolution and the schooling system of that? And, you grew up in a family where that was already foreign, Alistair, so you kind of feel that, right? But I sense that that's what will have to happen for the entire world. And that's why I started this conversation with, it can only happen locally, because people locally have to choose to build a school like that. Now, on a global stream, again, I sense a future where we are in very vivid exchange about what we're experiencing. but not so much to control and govern each other, but to simply aid in the exploration of that freedom. A few thoughts here. I'm happy for you to kind of pick and pull and let me know what you want to hear more of.
Yeah, after this like rather lofty excursus of mine and you riffing off it, I'm wondering from the micro to the meso to the macro, what are the building blocks that we need to play with on a micro level, almost like a sandbox? Could be a bigger chunk of property, could be an eco-village, could be a micro region, to the meso level of how do we govern such a bioregion, what ways to newly inform money, but also emergent new ways of governing ourselves, and how can we templatize them as to create like learning loops in between all these different sandboxes. Because when I look at the world out there for the first time in like 50 to 60 years, you actually have a whole new generations of eco-villages and bioregions, and even supported by national governments or local politicians. There's even, let's say, at least some funding flowing into this project. So I really have the feeling on top of this like micro, very place-based, customized 100% to the ground, to the temperature, the microclimate. We need this like meso level of mutual learning and templatizing for this mycelium to really spread and not just be some examples with good intentions, but that ultimately can't inspire like the broader the broader people, the broader mainstream.
You're asking for micro, mezzo, and macro examples?
I would no, not really. So when you look at the interviews and also the project or projects that you're like concretely immersed in, I think we will always have a micro level. So let's take the example. Let's take the garden. Okay, I take the garden where I grew up in Franconia. You have it's very healthy soil, but it has a very high degree of I don't know what the English word clay. So this is a very specific type of soil. This is like the micro. The meso level though of the garden, right? So the way we build like compost and different ways of compost, the way like we plant the different trees and shrubs and the vegetables is already the meso level, because my father did not make that up solely for himself, but he read books, and this can be done pretty much in any, let's say, European climate. On the macro level, I would say the German government supporting back in the 19th century, special ways of people to organize that has been very beneficial towards this like horticultural movement in the late 19th century, right? Has led to Germans actually growing quite a lot of vegetables in their backyard. So this just as an odd example of the own family garden from the micro to the meso to the macro level. And to hand that back to you, I'm curious on what levels of discernment within the various projects that you listened into are also involved in, you can learn. I ultimately really think it's on that meso, creating like learning loops in between all these different sandboxes and oases of projects is really important.
Yeah, well, there, to just share my kind of observation of what you're sharing there, those are currents that are observable. There's a micro, mezzo, and a macro level in this example. and between them there is an exchange, right? So like, yes, of course we did globalize as a planet, right? So we have this global exchange, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So paradoxically, it's a very bad thing if it continues to try to control everything, but it's a very good thing if it's just about people traveling and exchanging experience, right? Or exchanging experience in what we would currently maybe do across the internet in a way that allows us to learn non-local because of experience other people made. So I think there's tons of communication and learning between all of those levels, right? But I do think what's important from just the context of this interview today is that, you know, people often call this top down or bottom up. I just, you know, have absolutely fallen out of faith with a top down style of any form of growth, expansion, or governance. And really that's the hope of blockchain, right? The hope of Web 3.0, or maybe what will come through different forms of DeFi, is to decentralize our structures so that they can all learn with each other on a mezzo level, but they're independent of each other, because the macro is not a umbrella or a crown that governs it all, but it's more like a distribution wheel that just makes sure everyone gets to learn from everywhere and gets to exchange with everyone, right? And so when we bring this to the topic of finance, for example, we know it's possible. We know there's a big desire in people to create it. We know there's multiple currencies that are trying to propose versions of that. You know, I've interviewed some of them myself, and then we know there's a massive attempt to push that out of the market from the current federal reserves, the current government powers, and the current financial powers. And so that's what I meant earlier with we have to start saying no at some point, right? Like you mentioned Ukraine and Russia as an example. People will listen to this later on. Let's see if I'm right or wrong about it. But, you know, if you are Russian today, your banking card's already blocked. You are being pushed out of the financial system. This is going to start to happen in many places because the current controlled government cannot control us in the old system anymore. So it needs to build a new digital system, right? And so this new digital system, when created by the people and decentralized, it would literally mean the micro, mezzo, and macro level are communicating decentralized. There's lots of, you know, like a spiral dynamic behind all of human growth suddenly. And so the governments at play right now, you know, as long as you don't get lost in the polarity of what's right or wrong, or left or right, or this bad guy or that good guy, are pushing for a digital currency that is, you know, like a universal basic income that allows people to continue to be slaves in the 9-to-5 system, continue to be slaves in that kind of way of living. And so in that example, there is no micro, mezzo, macro. There's only macro to the micro, if that makes sense, to try to use your terminology there as well.
Yeah, I think we're not too far from a couple of rabbit holes we are sharing.
Did my best to stay out of the rabbit holes and just summarize the message, right? Because the rabbit holes are dangerous, right? Like getting lost in the duality of the mind is a very interesting game. Like this is how the media have controlled people for decades now. I mean, you give people a theater with a good guy and a bad guy, plus you know, feed all of the population tons of movies about good guys and bad guys. And so this polarity game in our mind starts to be engaged. And it takes quite a bit of personal like self-awareness and self-knowledge to say, no, actually, that makes no sense. Like, no.
That's basically what I meant. In my personal way to take in bits and bytes, or kilobytes, megabytes, and gigabytes of data information, I very consciously distribute them along the bell curve from very conservative, very mainstream, very central, very left wing, to awkward, hollow theory, flat earth, you know.
That's where I would fall off the edges at the flat word.
No, I also fall off.
Pun intended. I fall off the edge of that flat world. But like, here's another thing, Alistair, that I haven't said in this interview yet. That if you've listened all the way till here, dear listener, maybe this is going to be of value to you. In my own life, I've decided that true information and false information share an equal danger. They're just information. So what I mean with that is, fake news or false information, they take up a voltage of your processing power, a voltage of your attention, right? Of your desire to create something. And then you find out, oh, that was false information. So pretty obviously, it feels like a waste of time. But it's very similar sometimes with true information. It can capture you a whole day and you don't do anything you love. You don't do anything you believe in, because your mind is so engaged in who is doing what, where, and who is in charge and who. Well, bring the power back to yourself. And that's what I mean with the solutions can only be local. And the people that inspire me, the people that I've interviewed, those are all people that, to the best of their ability, step out of the duality of the media trance and the governmental control and just say, wait a second, I'm going to do what's my thing to do to give to the world in service to life. Now, they still make mistakes, but then those people also say, let me clean up my mistakes and come into integrity and keep going. But you can't do this if your mind is continuously captured and wrapped into the true or false, the right or wrong, the left or right. And for me, maybe my processing power is simply switched to a different equation. I couldn't take in all the news from all the way traditional to all the way left to all the rabbit holes. It would drive me crazy. And so I've decided to simply switch it off.
Don't mistake me. I'm mainly a doing guy. All I'm saying is there's way to curate media intake. And in this way, I really honestly try to make sure, like almost like you could vote in Germany, right? So in Germany, I really, not too much, but I try to understand classical conservative people, left wing, ultra left, ultra right, and the middle of the bell curve, right? And I think what makes me, I think this is actually a good comparison. Look, for whatever reason, God, the universe, the universal life force, gifted me with a very quick, like, processor. And the way that I serve my ecosystem, the organizations, the people, has to do with taking in and filtering, revamping, repackaging information, delivering decks, getting funding in, building teams, building brands, positioning brands, negotiating multi-stakeholder dialogues, organizing very complex constellations of people. So not only intuitively feeling the people and their perspective, because usually people would take a perspective, right? Including myself. So I think the information just helps me to like get a better perspective taking into the people. So much on that. On the other piece, I think, again, we're pretty similar in that, I don't know from which Zen master it comes, but he always said 1 gram or 1 ounce of practice weighs more than a ton of knowledge. So if you, dear listener, are one of those who did a lot of inner work and who is like taking in a lot of information, and not so much on the doing side of things, on the like sharing your purpose, whatever that is, nonprofit, for-profit, founding something, or if you want to be employed because you need that for the security, find the job, with the right fit, that's all good. But I'm definitely always up for the doing side. Actually pretty New Testamentical, right? Because you shall know them by their deeds. I often tell this people, I'm not so much interested in what people think or feel or their opinion on 9/11 or COVID or pro-vax or not vax is. I'm really more interested, what are you doing with your time? If you do something very simple and you're employed, but you want to make a difference, try to make a difference with that, right? Instead of just filtering and getting, eaten up by all the information. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to comment on the two
No,
pieces.
I love it. I love it. I think I want to, bring like a full circle to this conversation with what you just said. So what do you do with your time? Again, we shared different stories in this episode and, different points of view, and very pragmatic, very real, on the ground, what I'm doing with my time and with my focus right now, right? I said in the beginning briefly, I'm right in front of an event. This event is going to be a 2-week immersion with a small group of people from different countries at a agroforestry project, right? And so what I believe, it comes back to the doing, and everyone's going to do something different. It's important, right? We don't all have to do the same thing. But for me, it is learning from the projects that are already really inspiring, even if they make mistakes. So in this case, this agroforestry project, since a decade, has committed to a syntropic way of farming, which, if you don't know about syntropic farming or agroforestry, please do look it up. It's wildly powerful. Learning with nature rather than just producing food on a big scale. And in this specific case, there are 6 families. They all have children. They live on this big property, and they've created a little retreat center. And we're renting this retreat center, giving back to that project, right? Giving back to different indigenous projects around that project, and simply there to learn with each other. Now, I'm going to be teaching certain modalities like breath work, different games, different immersions, right? Other people are going to be there to immerse and learn with us. But they're not just learning from me. They're mainly learning from the land, and they're learning from the project that's on the land, because I'm learning from the land and the project that's on the land, right? So in my own world, I've started to create these circles and cycles. The podcast is one of them. My coaching practice is another one of them, that allow me to be in a constant give and receive between learning, teaching, listening, speaking. So I'm pulled in and out of my gifts and also my humility to understand, hey, I actually don't know anything about this. What do you mean? Circle dancing in a traditional Brazilian way? Let me be the quiet guy who's trying to make the right moves. Let me just play, right? And so that's what in my life has become the focus, is to create these environments in which I can become both a person who picks up the microphone and maybe guides or teaches, but equally the person who passes on that microphone to learn from someone else and to listen.
So it feels very round. So I don't have the feeling I would like to add more or ask more. Ever since we, got connected, I have the feeling we both meet on the doing side. We both meet on this stubbornly or perseveringly pursuing our unique, powerful self version. And I think for closing words, I really don't have more to share than wanting to inspire the people, not only through the podcast, but ultimately become a living example. Because this is like the ultimate learning loop. When you love what you do, you're good at it, it's what the world serves, and it's what you're paid for. Like, so the very classical ikigai, I like that model. I really think it's a very, very simple and intuitive one. And suddenly really magic starts to happen. You encounter amazing people, you earn solid money, it really makes a difference in the world. You're waking up, almost with like, a smile on your face and just looking on your schedule for the week ahead or the day ahead. And you're just like, okay, that's actually pretty fucking epic. And I want to inspire more people, I think, as much as you do, to follow that path. Because certainly most of those who can listen, right, have all the power, all the possibilities to manifest that in your life. I think that's good for me as closing words. How would you like to close it?
Yeah, that was beautiful. I would like to close it with repeating one more time that I believe human intelligence expresses in relationship, right? And so what that means is when you commit to your own path and your own journey, it doesn't matter if you're 15 or if you're 75 listening to this or anywhere in between. The people we surround ourselves with are a direct gateway to the next step in learning in our journey. So if you surround yourself with that family, with that tribe, or you hire a coach, or you hire you buy yourself into a program, these are steps in life to deliberately go into relationship for expansion and learning. And I just want to invite people to do that. You know, I believe in that kind of work. That's why it's part of my work as well. It's because we learn in relationship when we're being witnessed by a brother or a sister, when we're being guided by a mother or a father or a grandmother or grandfather. And so these relationships are pivotal to a new culture. And, you know, we don't marry every person we spend 3 months with. So there's lots of room for lots of different ways of saying yes to development. It doesn't all have to be linear. That's how I want to close, is to encourage people to step forward and let themselves be seen and supported.
Thanks,
Thank you, Alistair.
Julian. Thanks.
Thank you.